Brooklyn for Peace for tonight's exciting program. We're thrilled to have Greg Grandin here for a book talk on his new book, America, America, to be moderated by Amy Goodman. To start off, I'm Diana Suri. I'm the administrator for Brooklyn for Peace. And before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we're on the unceded land of the Lenape people, who cared for this land for generations before being forcibly removed. Let us honor their legacy, past, present, and ongoing, and reflect on the histories of displacement and migration that shape where we gather today. Since 1984, Brooklyn for Peace has worked to prevent war and address the injustices, whether they're social, racial, economic, or environmental, that lead to it. While primarily educational, we believe action, solidarity, and community building are essential to building the strong peace movement our times demand. Amazingly enough, Brooklyn for Peace has been able to sustain for 40 years with the generous donations of our community. And while we provide free programming, these events, such as today's, are not free to produce. So any donation given will go directly towards our programming and our support staff, and that's going to help ensure that Brooklyn for Peace can continue to educate and promote peace and justice across Brooklyn. It's a challenging time, we're all experiencing that, and Brooklyn for Peace is doing its best to step up to the crisis. And to continue to do our work, financial support from the community is essential. So you'll notice there are programs for tonight's event. On the back side, there is a QR code to make a donation if you can. Please contribute whatever you can. Any amount is really appreciated. We're deeply grateful to our co-sponsors for helping tonight's event come to life. We'd like to thank the Peace and Social Action Committee of the Brooklyn Monthly Meeting, New York City War Resistors League, Jacobin, and Peace Action New York State. We'd also like to thank Books Are Magic, our local bookstore that's handling the book sales tonight. So you'll see that the books are on for sale, and at the end of the book talk, Greg will happily sign those books. Now we're honored to welcome Greg Grandin, Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, and Peter V. and C. Van Woodward Professor at Yale. His acclaimed works include The End of the Myth, Empire's Workshop, Kissinger's Shadow, The Empire of Necessity, and Fordlandia. A former UN Truth Commission consultant on Guatemala, Grandin is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and is a regular contributor to The Nation, The New York Times, The Guardian, and Democracy Now! So please help me in welcoming Greg Grandin and Amy Goodman.
It's a great honor to be here with all of you, and especially to be here with Greg. Greg's work has been so important in redefining and broadening the frame, or shifting it entirely, how we see this country, how we see Latin America, and I'm really excited to be talking with you today, Greg. I wanted to begin, before we talk about the thesis of America, to talk about some of the latest events that have transpired, namely the new Pope in relation to the old Pope as well. But first, if you could talk about the significance of a Latin American leader who has just died, Jose Mujica.
Yeah, that's a great question. And before I start, I want to say thanks to Brooklyn for Peace for organizing this, and Jacobin also for co-sponsoring it, and friends for giving us the space. And of course, thank you for Amy. Usually it's Amy getting a text from somebody in Amy's orbit sometime around 11 o'clock at night asking if I could be at the Democracy Now! Studios at 7:30 in the morning. So it's nice to be able to ask Amy, do you think you can come and do this? And she readily agreed. So it's really fun. Jose Mujica, otherwise known as Pepe, was former president of Uruguay, and he became kind of famous as a very humble president. He drove a VW Bug, and sold flowers, and Noam Chomsky visited him, and he drove around in a bug, and there's a lot of photos going around the internet. He just died, he just passed away. I believe it was I didn't know I was going to ask this question, so I didn't. Was he 93?
89?
No, he was in the
N-
90s. I think he was in his 90s. What's that?
89.
89, okay. And he really was a remarkable leader. You know, you get one of these people get elevated as a symbol of humility and peace, but of course he was a member of the Tupamaros, an urban insurgent group in Uruguay, where he lived quite a remarkable life. He was captured, he escaped, captured, escaped, captured, escaped. For 14 years he was tortured. He was tortured by the torturers who were trained by the United States, by Daniel Mitrione, and for those of you who know that story, and the Tupamaros, of course, executed Mitrione.
And explain who Dan Mitrione was.
Dan Mitrione was a security advisor for the United States. I think, let's see, he probably worked under the auspices of USAID, if I'm not mistaken. And he trained first Brazilians and then Uruguayans in the technique of torture. He was famous for creating something called a dragon chair. Basically, you can imagine what it is. It was basically electrocution, torture by electrocution, and other techniques that would become famous, stress techniques that would become more well known during the War on Terror, which when we were told they weren't torture. They were just stress techniques, pressure techniques, whatever they were. And Mitrione was also infamous for taking homeless people off the street and using them as subjects to torture in lecture halls in Brazil and in Uruguay. And so anyway, this gets a little bit away from Mujica. Mujica was part of the Tupamaros, and they were an armed insurgency that actually formed before the coup, during the so-called democracy that wasn't much of a democracy. And he was arrested before the military coup. And he was tortured for 14 years. And then when he was released in Uruguay and Latin America returned to democracy, he became critical in creating the Frente Amplio, which was one of the most successful left alliances in Latin America, in the world. They've governed Uruguay mostly for the last couple of decades, except for the previous president, the one currently. And they're remarkable. So, I posted something on social media that, we didn't love Mujica because he sold flowers and drove a VW bug. We loved Mujica because he killed fascists when he was a Tupamaro. And because he understood, that behind that smile there was a lot of steel, and he understood that, that the point was to get power and to use power. And Frente Amplio is really one of the most inspirational expressions of militant democratic socialism that we have, and it's largely. I don't want to give him all the credit. He was a key leader in that coalition.
And around the same time, a few weeks before, Pope Francis died. And a few weeks later, Pope Leo XIV has been anointed, has been chosen. Both men, significantly, one from Argentina and the current one from the United States, but lived in Peru for some 20 years. He was known as Father Bob until he became Pope Leo XIV. But talk about this transition, what Pope Francis meant, and this goes to some of what you talk about in América, because it goes to liberation theology, and also what you think Pope Leo XIV, why he even took that name, might come to represent.
Yeah. I mean, we're in a moment where, we're in such a desperate moment that we're paying close attention to schisms and political factions within the Catholic Church. Sidney Hook famously called the Catholic Church the most totalitarian organization that ever existed in world history. So there's a lot of darkness related to the Catholic Church, and I talk about it in the book, but also there is this other impulse and current, which is the point of the book, the pulling it out, what leads to liberation theology. Pope Francis represented, he came to represent that schism whether he wanted to or not. He really was an individual that lived Latin America's 20th century in its fullest. He was born in Paranus, well, he was born before Peron, but he grew up in Paranus, Argentina, when the working class and the poor were making their entrance into the public square, into the public space, demanding social citizenship, and the state was responding. So he grew up in that circumstance. He became a Jesuit, and very quickly, as events spiraled out of control in Argentina towards the dictatorship in 1976, you know, he was not a radical, he was not a liberation theologian, but he was a Latin American, and he was a citizen of Argentina, you know, under Peron. So you can only, you know, you could be quite fascist, but you can also, but most people are, you know, tend to kind of straddle some kind of middle ground. There's evidence that it's a little dicey what he did or didn't do to protect Jesuits, particularly 2 Jesuits, one who accused him of turning them over to the military. He denied it. The Jesuits who accused him ultimately forgave him and said that they misspoke and that it was. But there's some people who read his subsequent career as an attempt to atone for his actions during the military regime in Argentina. And obviously when he became Pope, he brought with him all of this history of Latin America, and he was much more open, much more social. He represented and conveyed a critique of unbridled capitalism. He conveyed a strong critique of what we call neoliberalism as being anathema to the holism of what it means to be human. And his remarks kind of were part of this broadening schism between traditionalists and progressives within the Catholic Church. I'm not an expert in the Vatican. There's circles within circles, you know, that makes the name of the rose look like Harry Potter or something. You know, it's not anything that I'm an expert in, but I think Francis steered his way as best he could through the intricacies of the Vatican, and he put forward a very humanist, universal, to the degree that he could, with all of his faults and in all of the ways that we all know. And I think that his death was met with quite a lot of joy by people like, J.D. Vance, the Pope he either killed the Pope or the Pope, gave up and died after meeting Vance. I don't know, one or the other. But the new Pope represents a continuation in many ways. There's strong evidence that Pope Francis and Pope Bob Leo were collaborators. And he, of course, there is, and this speaks to the book, as other people point out, he's not the first American Pope. Pope Leo Francis was the first American Pope. He's the first Pope from the US, but even that doesn't really describe the fullness of his experience. He spent a significant time in Peru, including in northern Peru in the 1980s during the worst of that country's insurgency and counterinsurgency, Fujimoris and Luminoso land reform. He spent 2 years. I think it had a deep impact on him. There's stories coming out about how his grandfather was born. I mean, it's so wonderfully vague. It is inherently anti-MAGA because the idea MAGA represents some kind of purity. The idea that you can't quite pin where his grandfather was either born in Louisiana, the Dominican Republic, or Haiti, depending on my record. His maternal grandfather. And, who knows what's going to happen? I don't know what's going to happen, but I think the investment that people have in the leadership of the Catholic Church speaks to the larger vacuum of political organization and political vision that defines the moment that we live in, and that's why we're so fascinated about it. And I will say, as soon as I heard in the radio, I was on the car radio, as soon as I heard that he chose Leo the 14th, I knew immediately that the reference was Leo the 13th, and that he was a that the reference was the Rerum Novarum, an encyclical that Pope Leo was known as the workers' pope, labor pope. He was also known as the slaves pope because he wrote a strong letter condemning Brazilian slavery. Rerum Novarum is a kind of, at the time it was a kind of rearguard action against socialism, rising socialism, but it was also a strong critique of capitalism. It was an attempt to socialize capitalism. And I think that if you want to get a sense of what he imagines his role is, it's that in this moment of applied maybe to AI and our crypto overlords.
And standing up for immigrants and laborers.
Yes.
Amazingly, in the last months, he had tweeted, at least it's believed, 4 times, either criticizing Trump or J.D. Vance for their lack of compassion around immigrants.
Yeah, and obviously that's a social issue that splits the Catholic Church unambiguously, right? Abortion and gay rights and women's rights and sexual abuse scandals, right? Those all break down on patriarchy and people's, and it's on our wedge issues. But even conservative Catholics have some kind of concern for the treatment of immigrants, at least some of them.
And one of the last public statements Pope Francis made was once again calling for a ceasefire in Gaza and having one of his 2 Pope mobiles used as a mobile clinic for the children of Gaza. And in the first Sunday sermon that Pope Leo gave, he continued that call for a ceasefire.
It's very notable when he came out very strong with the Gaza, Ukraine, migration, and his critique of AI as a kind of anti-humanist threat to humanity. So there was one other thing now when you were talking I had thought of, but now it slipped my mind. Anyway, maybe I'll come back to it.
Which brings us to América. First, you just said he wasn't the first American Pope. Of course, Francis was also American. And what América means, and how you are reframing not only the history of the United States, but all of Latin America with these countries vis-a-vis each other, instead of always, when talking about the United States, looking toward Europe.
Yeah. My editor says at these events I need to be less abstract and talk more about the stories in the book. But there's a lot of stories in the book, and they're all good. A lot of interesting people. You can just take my word for it.
No, we're going to dig into that because I agree with your editor.
But I'll give you the bigger picture. So the book starts with the Spanish conquest, and it ends. I can't quite say it ends with Gaza because I was writing it as Gaza was unfolding, and I can't say it ends with Trump because I was writing it before the Trump election. But it gestures, it moves towards that moment. So in some ways you can say the book is from the conquest to Gaza, and there is a kind of through line. The argument is that the conquest of the New World, the Spanish conquest of the New World in the early 1500s was of an order of a different kind of brutality than Europeans had ever seen before. Not so much because the nature of the bloodshed, but because of the fact that these were people that had to be explained, right? There was no denying. Spain, unlike England, couldn't deny that they were conquering a people. Bartolomé de las Casas, an early critic, a Dominican critic, thought there was more people in the Americas than there were in Europe. And Catholicism is a religion that presumes to be universal. It presumes to be the bearer of universal history. It presumes to be the bearer of universal wisdom. And it had to justify what it was doing. It couldn't just go in and start slaughtering people. Of course, that's what they did. But in order to there was also an enormous ideological or moral edifice that had to be grappled with. And that was Catholic humanism, and where the new people of the New World fit into the history of the world and the history of humanity. And I can go into the details later, or you can read about it. But basically there emerges a very strong critique by a number of Dominican and Franciscan and later Jesuit theologians and jurists that question pretty much everything about the Spanish conquest, including the legitimacy of the conquest itself. They put forward a strong case for the abolition of slavery in all of its forms. De las Casas was famous for declaring that all humanity is one. The actual Spanish, the English translation of the actual Spanish is all human lineage is one, meaning all human beings come from a single community, right? They're not another species. They're not, there's not a, they're not a subhuman. They're not a different race of animals or whatever. They're all humanity is one. There was also a strong argument for the narrowing of what constituted a just war to very narrow criteria. Now, these critiques didn't necessarily stop the conquest, but they were consequential in the long run. The conquest went on, De las Casas died, and Spain created this enormous empire in all of the New World, a century before the Puritans set down in Plymouth, and it was magnificent in many ways. But at the center of it were Native Americans and then African Americans. They were the extractors of the New World's wealth, so they were the center of that. There was no denying them. But they were also the center of this kind of moral debate about the nature of Catholicism and the nature of humanity that went on and on and on. So the point is, there was no evasion. The tension that is laid out is with what happens, 100 years later when the Mayflower and other ships, the following ships show up, and northern New England is already decimated by plagues brought by Europeans before the Mayflower shows up, and Puritans get off the ship. Look, where is everybody? Look at this. It's empty. Literally, it's houses that are empty. And they develop a case for dominion based on empty land, that there was no people there. And this tension between a colonial empire that grapples and wrestles, no matter how hypocritical, with the reality of people and difference, compared with an empire that pushed difference out towards the frontier and denied it, right? And Native Americans weren't central to the colonial extraction. I mean, it was the fur trade and all of that, but not really the way silver and mercury and gold and copper was in Spanish America. So I trace those two tensions out, that kind of grappling with, and then the argument goes on to the wars of independence, and what happens is that the United States breaks away from England and revitalizes the doctrine of conquest. It reinforces the doctrine of conquest. The doctrine of conquest in the United States was taught by law professors into the 1920s as a legitimate principle of international law in the United States. And this had to do with moving west and taking Creek land, Cherokee land, Mexican land, and driving to the Pacific. Latin America comes into being a continent of multiple 7 republics, and they had to learn how to deal with each other. And one of the first things they do is they start to undermine the doctrine of conquest, and they invalidate the doctrine of conquest. And they spend the next century trying to get the United States to accept their vision of international law. And they do. The story, I go through Wilson, I go through FDR, I go through the role of Latin America in the great anti-fascist struggle of the 1930s and 1940s, and the expectations of what the defeat of fascism in Europe meant for Latin America. But mostly important, I talk about how Latin America, basically all of the principles that are put into place in 1945 with the United Nations that are called the rules-based order or the liberal international order, a rejection of a conquest, a rejection of war of aggression, and the premise that international relations should be organized around cooperation rather than competition, and eventually a rejection of colonialism. All of that was present at Latin America's creation, even if only in fledgling form, in embryonic form, but then develops and gets stronger as it's contesting the United States. So that's the argument. Now, of course, we'll jump forward 50 years and the doctrine of conquest is back, and just to bring it back to relevance, and what we see its burlesque form in Trump when he says he's going to take Greenland by force or turn Canada into a state, and he says he's going to use coercion. It seems, we're not really sure what to make of that. I think what he's doing is he's signaling a shift in the foundational premise of the international order, that nations are no longer organized around the premise of cooperation and shared interests, but they're organized around the premise of competition. And of course, we see its more fearsome expression in Gaza, where the doctrine of conquest is completely revitalized. And the word conquest is used, with abandon and without care, without any shame. So in some ways, that's why the book could have been called from Cortez to Netanyahu, or something like that.
Interestingly, Trump is on this Gulf tour, his first major international trip, and there has been some suggestion that he wants to change the name, the Persian Gulf, to the Gulf of Arabia.
That's a long-standing thing.
The reason, right, people actually believe it is because what he's done with the Gulf of America. And my favorite review of yours in the Los Angeles Times, the headline was "The Gulf of América." I think that's a pretty good compromise.
Yeah, it's a compromise.
But I want to sort of push your editor's line in telling us stories. Go from Simón Bolívar and really specifically talk about the effect Latin America had on FDR and the New Deal, and tell us about a radical journalist who we didn't get to talk about on Democracy Now!, though I promoted it, and that was Ernest Gruning, and what he has to do with all of this.
So I'll talk about that. I'll come back to Bolivar. There's a big gap between Bolivar and Gruning. So, a big part of the book is, this tension, right? That to understand American exceptionalism in its fullest form, I'm being abstract again, you need to understand not just the United States, but all of the Americas, how there was this competition between Latin America and the United States over things like the doctrine of conquest. And for years, Latin America and the United States would meet in these Pan-American conferences, and Latin America would complain about, the latest outrage that the United States did, and would demand that the United States give up the right of intervention and recognize the absolute sovereignty of individual nation. And for years, Latin American diplomats would ignore them and say, no, okay, whatever. Then the Depression hits, 1929. Roosevelt's elected in 32. He's inaugurated in 33, March 33. He has a series of failed international conferences in Europe that doesn't achieve any kind of sense that there was hope for stability. But there is this other conference on the horizon, and that's in Montevideo, where Pepe Mujica was, would he have been born in 1933 if he was, no. When would he have been born if he was 89? 35, okay. Okay, so 1933 was the conference, and Mujica would have been born within 2 years. So there's this Pan-American conference scheduled. And Roosevelt wants Cordell Hull, his Secretary of State, to go down and deal with the Latin Americans. And Roosevelt, when he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, he was a pretty big imperialist. He claimed to have written Haiti's constitution. He tried to buy a bunch of land in Haiti. In that constitution, it forced Haiti to allow foreigners to buy land. I mean, Roosevelt had a reputation of being a little bit of a brash of an imperialist up until he became, I guess, a politician and a reformer. But he sends Cordell Hull, and he says, look, give them whatever they want, give them, lights so they can land planes at night, but don't make any changes to international law, and don't agree for us to give up the right of intervention. But this is 1933, and politics are a lot looser then, and Hull's his delegation is it's made up by lawyers and State Department men who are making sure that Hull is saying the right thing. But he also brings Ernest Gruning, who is an editor at The Nation and a committed anti-imperialist. People might know Gruning as a senator from Alaska who cast a vote against the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. But then he had written constantly on Haiti, and he had 4 sisters, and they were all part of the radical New York Jewish left that was active and allies with the NAACP and W.E. Du Bois, and they were writing about racism and the Klan at home, and Gruning was writing about Mexico and Haiti, and he writes to Felix Frankfurter, his friend, and he says, "I'd really like to go on this delegation. Do you think you can can ask?" I don't know what they would call Franklin, I guess, if there's a spot for me. And Roosevelt agrees. I mean, it would be like sending Amy. It would be like as if they sent Amy down to, if Trump and, who's that guy that they got negotiating Gaza? What's the name? What?
Wickoff?
Yeah, Wickoff. It's like Wickoff and Bourdain, to go negotiate with Iran. And Gruning's, and of course they're traveling by ocean liner, so they have a lot of time, and Gruning basically lectures Hull about Latin American history. And there's a weird confluence that happens. Hull is from Tennessee, and in his mind, he equates Reconstruction and the occupation of the North and the imposition of the North with the United States. I mean, we like Reconstruction, we don't like U.S. intervention in Latin America. He saw it, in his mind, he saw them as kind of equivalent, right? Like the arrogance of Northerners imposing their will on Southerners. And he was also a free trader. He was on the right side of the New Deal. And in his mind, he also came to see an equation between free trade and non-intervention. So by the time he gets to Buenos Aires, by the time he gets to Montevideo, he completely capitulates to every one of Latin America's demand. And he is hailed as an unconquering hero. He basically gives up the right to conquest, the right to intervention, and he recognized the absolute sovereignty in the internal and external affairs of all nations, no matter what their size. And he's having such a good time, he doesn't want to leave. He's drinking. His prohibition isn't quite over in the United States, but he says the first thing he's going to do is he's going to lower tariffs on Latin American rum. And that's what he does. So he makes it back to the United States, and it turns out, and of course Roosevelt quickly figures out that this is gold. It's gold. It's gold, Jerry. It's gold. And he obtains for Hull the power to negotiate reciprocal tariff treaties with individual nations. And so he signs about 6 or 7 treaties right away with Latin American nations that lower tariffs. It's like we're living in an upside down world, right? We're living in the bad neighbor policy, the good neighbor policy. And that creates, at this time the New Deal was kind of under siege. The first kind of reformist period had exhausted itself. The right was mobilizing. The right was mobilizing in these kind of Liberty League, kind of quasi-fascist Saxon paramilitary organizations. And there was a lot of labor violence, strong reaction against labor reform laws. A lot of the economic elites who supported Roosevelt in '32 broke with him, but Hull wins them back because of these treaties with Latin America. And at the same time, we know the good neighbor policy as a kind of catchphrase that every politician talks about in Latin America, and we know about it because Roosevelt used it to talk about Latin America. What we know less about it, it was also the phrase that was used to talk about FDR's domestic get out the vote campaign. His campaign created good neighbor leagues. And these good neighbor leagues were used as a way to counter the liberty leagues, to put forward a kind of new ethics of social citizenship and a new cultural pluralism or tolerance. So the good neighbor leagues would organize Latinos in New Mexico and Native Americans in Arizona and Jews in New York and African Americans in the South and in Chicago. And they became like the main, Roosevelt said he liked the word so much he wanted to patent it, the good neighbor leagues. So these good neighbor leagues, and of course, the argument in the book is that Roosevelt, because of Hull's actions, and largely because of he listened to a radical journalist, created the possibility not only of beating back fascism or extremism in the United States, but Roosevelt won that election, that 1936 election, with 27 million votes, more votes than any other human being ever won in world history, and he ran it on largely a social democratic platform. And it was remarkable. You know, you just ran the table in this unlikely coalition of non-intervention, free trade, this new kind of corporate bloc that didn't mind Roosevelt's domestic reform as long as he continued to promise to open up markets, and there's this expanding voting coalition of a diverse, expanding voting coalition. And what's the first thing that he does after he wins? Can anybody guess what the first thing Roosevelt does? Like a week after he wins this historic election. Somebody take a guess. What? No, he goes to Buenos Aires. He takes a victory lap, but in Latin America. And he begins to shore up an anti-fascist continental coalition. And so the book talks about that and how that, so there was fear among strategists that Latin America, Mexico, Latin America could go the way of Spain, right? A lot of the socioeconomic indicators that led to the nationalist revolt in Spain were present in Latin America. And there was a fear that they could lose Latin America to right-wing nationalists and who would ally with Hitler and Mussolini. And the fact that Roosevelt effectively extended the New Deal, but not just because there was also domestic sources of social reform in Latin America, many of them, and I'm not by no means in my argument that it all comes from the United States, but Roosevelt, by legitimating, by tipping the table in their favor, tipped the favor away from the fascists and towards the Democrats, and basically secured Latin America as this anti-fascist redoubt that becomes, Russia won the war. We all know Russia won the war, but beat Germany, at least in the European theater. But Latin America was pretty crucial. The United States didn't have to fight one war of resources because of Latin America. That bit in Brazil that bulges out becomes a kind of becomes a key transit point in which they bring nonstop, cargo planes are flying nonstop into Northern Africa, bringing men and material into the European theater and North African theater. But then also Latin America itself, the goodwill of Pan-Americanism becomes the symbol of what Roosevelt repeatedly says we want the world to be once the war is over. If you want to know what we want after the post-war, look to Latin America. Roosevelt says it, Truman said it, Wilson said it earlier during World War I. But so that's kind of in some ways the core of the book.
Talk about the killing of Jorge Eliezer Gaetan.
Well, I have to explain who he is first. So this brings us to Colombia. Now, of course, this goodwill doesn't last. Anybody who knows anything about Latin America knows that that's not the end of the story. The United States does not continue to support social democrats in Latin America after FDR's death. And and even earlier after Henry Wallace is booted off the ticket. But Henry Wallace plays a big part. He's another character. The U.S. during World War II invested an enormous amount of repressive capacity in the security forces of Latin America in the fight against fascism. As the United States turns from fighting fascism to fighting the left or fighting communism, so too do these security forces. And so there's an enormous amount of hope in Latin America, right? Latin Americans thought they were fighting not just against fascism, but for social democracy. And in 1945, nearly every Latin American country was some kind of social democracy. And there was, in its most jubilant kind of raucous sense, strikes, protests, people on the street expanding the franchise, expanding social spending. And, in 1945, I think only 3 or 4 Latin American countries weren't social democratic. Within 2 years, only 3 or 4 of those democracies were left, right? The tide turned quickly under Truman, and with the shift of the United States from supporting the left against the right to supporting the right against the left. And I tell the story of Jorge Gaitan to kind of capture this. Jorge Gaitan is a story particular to Colombia. And I wanted to tell this story because Colombia is confusing, and it doesn't often fit in the narratives that we tell about Latin America, or not easily. There's a lot of things that go on in Colombia. And it kind of is like, so I thought, for myself, I wanted to include Colombia to get a handle on it. Gaitan was a fascinating figure. He was a liberal. Colombia had 2 main parties that still use the words liberal and conservative. During the 1930s, the liberals became increasingly social liberal, if not socialist, at least the rank and file or the left wing of it. And the conservatives have become increasingly fascist or falangist during the 1930s and 1940s. And Gaitan had enormous support. He was expected to win the 1950 election. He had built his support arguing and advocating as a lawyer for rural peasants in the countryside that was subject to paramilitary violence by landlords and conservative paramilitaries. He famously, the massacre that happens at the end of 100 Years of Solitude, that's based on a real event that happened in 1928, a real massacre. Gaitan became a kind of advocate for those banana workers. He gave these filibuster speeches. He took advantage of the new forms of radio, and he spoke in a kind of new style, in a kind of populist style, not the stilted formalism of Spanish legalism, vosotros. He spoke like la gente, and people responded, and he was enormously popular. So in April 1948, everything comes together. In April 1948. George Marshall is arriving to help found the Organization of American States, which in the United States' new geopolitical vision is going to be a key institution within the kind of national security framework and the Cold War. And so Pan-Americanism was transforming into the Organization of American States. Radical students who already sensed that the United States had shifted its policy and they began protesting, showed up. They were paid for by Betancourt in Venezuela and Perón in Argentina to protest the United States. Among them, Fidel Castro, who was a young lawyer. Gabriel Garcia Marquez was in Bogota because he was studying law and he lived in a pension. Camilo Torres, who was a Colombian, who was a famous a precursor to liberation theology, was in seminary, in Dominican seminary, and he was there. The Somoza family was there. A whole bunch of U.S. attachés, meaning the new kind of CIA that was just established in 1947, was there. And the conference had started. It was supposed to be a month-long event, and it was a month-long event. But, and also, what was interesting is Latin Americans were demanding a Marshall Plan. They wanted their own Marshall. This is a big deal. They expected for their sacrifice during the war that there would be free and public capital and credit in which, an investment in which to develop and move away from extractive industries. They wanted what Europe was getting, and they felt like they deserved it. Marshall shows up, he gives a couple of speeches. There's not going to be any Marshall Plan. You have to attract private capital. You have to attract private capital and private investment. And the effect of this, of course, is that by attracting, what do you have to do to attract private capital? You have to pacify your labor forces, what you have to do. Europe didn't have to do that, and therefore you could have social democracies and Christian democracies taking form, reformers that were anti-Soviet but still managing to build a welfare state. In Latin America, there was no room for that middle ground because there was no Marshall Plan. So George Marshall goes and he gives a couple of speeches. One he gives on April 7th, that there's not going to be a Marshall Plan. You have to, and lectures Latin America about, and they haven't even gotten to the security protocols yet that he wanted Latin America to sign on. April 8th at 1:09, Jorge Gaitan leaves his law office, and he's going to lunch with a group of people, and a man named Roa comes up behind him and shoots him 3 times in the back and kills him. And Bogota explodes. It's called the Bogotazo. Rosetta is dragged into a drugstore. He's kept alive, but the crowd pulls him out and beats him to death. The boot blacks beat him to death with their shine boxes. It's like a scene from Goodfellas or something. Fidel Castro, as a young student, he actually had an appointment with Gaitan later that afternoon. He grabs a rifle from a police station, he jumps up on a bench and he tries to organize, and he says, "Nobody listened to me." And he takes this as a big lesson battle, and that you had to build a political organization before you could have a revolution. And this is in 1948. And Colombia, Bogota just is devastated. Somebody said it was worse than London during the Blitz, one of the US generals. And Marshall had the good sense to continue to hunker down, gather the delegates in a bunker and continue and basically get them all to sign on to a number of protocols that had to do with anti-communism and policing communism and security protocols. And they also stopped complaining about not having a Marshall Plan. And this went on, the riot went on for a week before Bogota was pacified, and then of course it gave way to decades of warfare in the countryside, which we don't have time to talk about. But I will say that the thing about Gaitan's death is that Colombians are obsessed about it the way US is obsessed about JFK, and for much the same reason. It's almost as if, like, there's so many theories about who killed him. Rosetta was deemed to be mentally unstable, somebody who was obsessed with the occult, with conspiracism, which he may have picked up at the German embassy, because there's this weird connection between fascism and mysticism and occultism. It's my sense is that he was killed by conservative paramilitaries that were linked to one particular death squad. But that didn't really come out. The Scotland Yard sent people to investigate, the US FBI investigated, Colombia investigated. It was never decided, never clear who was behind or what the motive was. It was deemed that he was mentally unstable. So so this is like one of these killings that like JFK, it's kind of, for Colombians, it's, Mario Vargas Llosa has that great line from one of his novels, Peruvians want to know when exactly their country fucked up. And you could say the same thing about Colombia, and they have an exact date, 1:09 in the afternoon on April 8th. And it's this sense of a leader that, was killed under mysterious circumstances, that had he lived, the country would have been a better place. That is Gaitan in many ways for Columbia, and he's still a subject of novels and playwrights. So I take that, the reason why I take that and use that is because it compresses so much of the Cold War, that moment. And then I kind of trace out liberation theology through Camilo Torres and kind of heterodox economic critique through Raul Prebisch, and George Kennan, who right after the Bogotazo wrote a memo talking about how the United States had to mobilize a permanent psychological global war, and be on guard, and that in some ways was a direct result of Bogotazo. And I talk about that in Latin America, and I talk about, as I mentioned, I think liberation theology through Camilo Torres, and I trace out the post-war history. I'm sorry you asked about Gaetan.
No. I mean, the book is fascinating. All of your work is truly epic. And I'm wondering why you came to focus on Latin America. I mean, in your life, your own story. Won the Pulitzer Prize for The End of the Myth, and just prize after prize for these epic works that you do. Did it begin as a kid?
No. It began at Brooklyn College. I took about 8 years off after high. I didn't take years off. I didn't know what I was doing. I just didn't go. After high school, I just kind of worked in restaurants and did a bunch of different things. And then my friend's father got me into the IBEW. Local 3, the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. It's a real job and good pay. You can't turn it down easily. Right? It's not a job you can turn down easily. But I had, and I was trying to think of a way of getting out of it, taking the job. And around the same time, I was picking up a friend at Brooklyn College, and I filled out an application, and I was accepted. And I said, okay, local B. Electrician of Brooklyn College. Electrician of Brooklyn College. I'll go to Brooklyn College. So I went to Brooklyn College, and I kind of fell in with a bunch of older students and professors, a lot of them who were hired in the 1960s, and still very much engaged with critical theory and critical thought. To them, the question was whether Gorbachev was going to save socialism. And so, this became a burning question, and I started studying Russian, but at the same time I became involved in CISPIS, and Central America was the main thing that was happening, and the Contra War, and the death squads in El Salvador. I became involved in CISPIS at the same time. And so basically, once it was clear that Gorbachev wasn't going to save socialism, and then I wasn't going to learn Russian, I switched to Latin America, and we were reading a lot of social history, like E.P. Thompson and things like that, and I realized that that nobody was doing that in Central America. Nobody was doing that in Guatemala or Nicaragua. That kind of social history, that kind of Gramscian political culture history, and except a few people. And I thought that there was something that I might pursue, and then so I applied to graduate school, and here I am.
And in doing this work, América, a new history of the New World, what surprised you most?
You asked me this on the show. I didn't have an answer for it then.
I'm giving you a second chance.
Yeah. What is Zizek said, I'm a Hegelian, I'm never surprised. Well, that Gulag Good Neighbor stuff, the domestic, Woodrow Wilson's, who is normally taught, and my approaching this book, Woodrow Wilson as just a kind of uptight imperialist, that ran roughshod over Mexico and Haiti. He grappled with Latin America. Latin America was a big intellectual challenge to him in many ways, and so I kind of traced that out, and a lot of that was very surprising to me.
Are you saying redeeming?
No, not redeeming anymore, that, but being able to understand it historically. I mean, I think, Wilson, during moments when he should have turned one way, turned another way. But certainly, I think the book helps understand his turn towards reaction, if you understand it through the prism of Latin America more. Latin America, he devoted, he was constantly preaching to his cabinet about Latin America. In fact, he said that the United States, he could argue any side of the argument at any given time. He used Latin America to argue for both peace and for war, and why the United States should superintend the world. He said the United States has done a lot of transgressions in Latin America, but we've been chastised. We've been humbled by Latin Americans. Latin Americans have taught us not to be arrogant, and therefore we can be a self-interested, a disinterested hegemon. So he basically used the experience of Latin America to justify the United States' ascent to global aspirations. But, a lot of things surprised me. It's a 700-page book.
Did it surprise you how heavy it was?
Yeah. No.
I want to make sure that people have a chance to get your book and have you sign it. It's really important, and it's a book to give as gifts and also to get for yourself, to give a gift to yourself. But before we finish up, I want to give you all a chance, if you have a question or have a comment, to take the mic. Yes.
Now come up.
Do you want?
Can you take here?
Who was that?
Hey, Chad.
And you can even say your name.
Hey.
Yes, Jed Abrahamian. I'm intrigued how Mexico was able to get away by nationalizing the oil industry. It must have been under FDR.
Yeah, I deal with this so for those who don't know, Mexico, this is going to be, I'll try not to make this a long answer like Gaetan, but Mexico was the United States' first nation-building project after the Civil War. U.S. capital, and the United States turned Mexico into an exporting nation governed by a heavy hand. And the Mexican Revolution in 1910 was basically the first Third World Revolution against capitalism and its justifying, enabling mythologies. And it passed a constitution in 1917 that was a liberal constitution in the sense that it had all of the liberal rights of restraining a state and allowing individuals the greatest room for freedom, but it was also the world's first social democratic constitution. And it guaranteed education and healthcare and the right to join a labor union, but it also said that private property is a privilege granted by the state, and the state owned all subsoil resources. This provision, was like an alarm bell in the night for the people who resided over the North American economy, because it basically presumed that private property was not an inherent untouchable right, and it was the basis of Mexico's radical land reform, which really took place in the 1930s under Cardenas, President Cardenas, and oil nationalization, which was also the 1930s. And basically, the short answer is the United States had to accept it because of the Depression, because of World War, because of rising tensions in Europe, and because Roosevelt kept siding with his ambassador, and his ambassador in Mexico, Josephius Daniels, who in the United States was a Cold Stone racist, involved in the Wilmington massacre in 1898. He goes to Mexico and he has like a come to Jesus moment where he all of a sudden becomes this radical and starts supporting all of these reforms and against Cordell Hull. He's constantly arguing with Cordell Hull. Hull wants Mexico to compensate. Mexico doesn't have the money to compensate for all of these expropriations. But FDR constantly sides with Daniels and Cardenas against Hull. So, but basically, it's FDR. It's FDR that wisdom that what was needed was to socialize U.S. capital, not necessarily continue to serve as U.S. capital's agent abroad. And that was the main reason. The threat of fascism. Should I?
Here?
Oh yeah. Should I go? Oh.
So my question is about Pan-American labor and the possibilities and problems of an international labor movement that unites workers in the United States and in Latin America. I'm curious what sort of possibilities and problems that you see. Where are the openings? Where are the weaknesses? And I'm thinking specifically about the USMCA renegotiations coming up next year, as well as the UAW's call for a May Day strike in 2028. It seems to me like because capital is international, the only way to really fight against capital is for labor to be international, but I think right now a lot of workers and unions are thinking very nationalist terms. So what do you see as the state of the labor movement in Latin America, and where can workers in the United States link up with our brothers and sisters and siblings in Latin America?
Yeah. Well, I think there are a lot of linkages. I think there are, there's certainly, there's transnational peasant movements and transnational workers movements. And in some ways it's a more hopeful period because there's not the, during the Cold War labor unions supported, basically run by the CIA, creating, third way labor unions were devastating for Latin America in terms of being able to, even though they wound up being targets themselves, but groups like the American Federation of Free Labor Development, which was basically a CIA outfit during the Cold War, working with, unions and union confederations were devastating for creating solidarity. Any kind of solidarity. That doesn't exist anymore, because it seems like the institutions of hegemony have completely broken down. So in some ways it leaves the opening for these kind of connections. I don't really have anything more profound other than that. But yes, I'll just say that is the thing about NAFTA, right? NAFTA is the crown jewel of economic integration and globalization. It freed capital, it freed commodities, but it captured labor. It trapped Mexican labor, and that was the point of it. That's why Clinton militarized the border simultaneously with passing NAFTA, because the idea was to keep a kind of system of labor arbitrage in place on the border. And I think that's a lot at stake in the migration politics. But I'd rather make it more profound.
We're going to end with this last question right here.
Thank you, and Professor Grandin, thank you for your amazing books. My name is Lucy Paguada Quesada. I am from Honduras. And my question goes back to 1823 and the Monroe Doctrine and the Bolivarian Doctrine also, how they are still being pushed by the United States in today's Latin American history, but how many countries like my own, Honduras, are moving more towards the Bolivarian doctrine. And so we see that conflict too between Bolivarianism versus Monroeism. And it's very clear and it's very strong right now in Latin America. How do you see that?
Well, I see it very strongly. This has been going on for a while. Obviously, I don't want to give a history lecture on the Monroe Doctrine, but I will say that, during the rise of the post-Cold War left in Latin America, under George W. Bush, the left operated with much more confidence and rhetorical hegemony. Chavez and Lula and Morales and Kirchner, and they strode the international stage, and they really kind of established a certain kind of legitimacy in opposing George Bush's wars. What we see now, I think, and a lot of that was undermined not by Bush but Obama. The Obama administration was much more effective at undermining the left in Latin America through supporting lawfare coups in Brazil and Honduras, right, in 2009, and in Paraguay. But even more worrisome is the export of a lot of the culture politics nonsense that paralyzes and polarizes the United States into Latin America. I mean, back a couple of decades ago with Chavez and Lula, the right was the traditional patrician, anti-communist, law and order, patriarchal right, and they couldn't win at the polls. They couldn't win. Maybe they won here and there, but on the whole, it was the left that had energy. Now, the right in Latin America has been injected with the same kind of mania that has overcome, the U.S. right, and intentionally so, not just by coincidence or circumstance. There are libertarian organizations and right-wing church organizations that are building ties. So now you hear things about groomers, and you hear things about gun rights, and a politics that's very, everybody hates Judith Butler, Judith Butler, all of that stuff. The crypto nonsense, and we see it in El Salvador with Bukele. This just won in Ecuador with Noboa, they haven't been able to build up themselves into a continental culture conf yet. But the possibility, it's like I think Latin America is kind of on a knife's edge in some ways. It still has a very strong left. The majority of Latin Americans live under governments that define themselves as leftist, but people are tired of crime and they're tired of violence, and the Bukele model, is tempting for some people. But then on the other hand, you have Claudia Sheinbaum, who does represent, a Jewish granddaughter of refugees from the Holocaust, from communist refugees, who is now sitting in the Spanish Viceroy's office with 85% approval rating, redistributing land under Article 27. It's kind of amazing, and that is a real alternative still. And Mexico, by all accounts, should have the same kind of appeal. Bukeleism should have the appeal in Mexico. People are tired of crime, they're tired of violence, they're tired of corruption. But the left, Morena, first AMLO, and then now Claudia, have been able to build a political project that, delivers real material gains while having a vision of what a just society is. It's quite hopeful, but Latin America as a whole, it's scary. Sorry.
Well, Grandin, we want to thank you so much for your incredible work. And I thought that I would be a model for what people should be doing, and that is getting some books. I've already got my 4 for my niece and for my colleague, for a young woman who's just finished her first year at Sarah Lawrence, and for another friend. And think about that. Think about birthdays, think about getting it for yourself, think about gifts to students, but this is a fantastic book. Thank you so much.
Just briefly, everyone, just a couple minutes, so you can purchase the book outside, and then Greg will be here for signatures. I just want to take a couple minutes and introduce Caroline Eisenberg. She is our vice co-chair and co-founder of Goodman for Peace. She'd like to have a couple minutes to just make an announcement.
I don't mean to sound like the 13th fairy at Sleeping Beauty's party, but I want to say just a word about Gaza.
Right?
And I'm sure everybody here is feeling the same stress of knowing that every day that goes by is a day where people are suffering and dying. I did want to just mention two things about that have happened in Congress that people might not be aware of. So one quasi-good thing is that 98 members of Congress wrote to the Israeli ambassador to insist that humanitarian aid be provided to Gaza now. And it's actually a good letter in a number of different ways because the Israelis have been putting forward their plan for aid, which is a terrible plan. And this letter actually sidesteps that in asking for a different kind of plan. So that's one very, quasi-positive development. If you're curious about Brooklyn legislators on this matter, you will not be shocked to know that Goodman has not signed it. However, Nydia Velázquez has, and in an apparent change, some change, Yvette Clarke has also signed on to that letter. And so that is actually something that's happened, and there are other statements coming out from the House. The thing that I especially wanted to mention to people, however, is that as of about the last 24 hours, there is now a resolution in the Senate which specifically calls for the immediate resumption of humanitarian aid into Gaza. And that resolution is S-Res 244. And that resolution in the space of 24 hours has gathered, I think it's now 28 co-sponsors. I hate to give bad information. It's here somewhere. You're right. You're right. Thank you. So it's A-Stress 224. We'll send out this information. But what I wanted to say is, first of all, this is like getting 28 senators to say anything about this. You know, it's a little late, but that's happening. However, if you're curious about our New York senators, neither of them has signed on to that. And so one of the things that we will be asking for people to do, and we'll send out a notice with the accurate number, is to be calling our New York senators and asking them to join. And I just want to say one other thing about making these phone calls, because probably all of you are a little tired of doing this. But one thing is, if you're not getting an answer, one thing you can do with the senators is they have all these district offices. So if they're not answering in Washington, people will be answering elsewhere. And it's also helpful to keep in mind that the numbers here are really what's critical. I know for certain that in Gillibrand's office, they count how many phone calls they're getting. So to be super useful, when you put out your next call, try, and again, we'll send you the information the next day or something, but try to get 10 friends to do it as well. We really need to multiply as quickly as possible the amount of pressure we generate. And although that's really difficult, but it's really essential to do it. So I'm finished with my sort of quasi-bad news, quasi-good news. But there's a lot to be done. I'm sure everybody sitting here now feels the same degree of urgency that we have to do something to try to bring this horrible thing to an end. So thank you. And again, thank you to Greg.